They say every family has secrets. Some are small, whispered things hidden in the corners of dusty attics. Others are darker, buried beneath decades of shame, so deep that even memory refuses to touch them. This story begins in a place that most maps would rather forget, tucked between the dense pines and winding rivers of rural Appalachia. Here, a single family line persisted for generations, isolated by geography and circumstance, but not by desire. In this forgotten pocket of America, bloodlines intertwined so tightly that they became a cage as much as a connection. And within this cage, the most unlikely, unsettling thing began to happen. Cousins, close in blood and closer in secrecy, could not stay apart. From the outside, they appeared ordinary. Children playing in the yard, young adults working the fields, families attending church on Sundays. But behind the doors of their clapboard homes, a different reality took shape. The rules that governed most lives, the ones that separated kin, that defined morality, simply did not exist here, or perhaps they were rewritten by the sheer force of isolation. Stories passed down through generations spoke of family gatherings that lasted days, where marriages were not just unions of affection, but practical solutions to survival, keeping property and influence within the same narrow circle. Yet somewhere along the line, what was practical became something more twisted, something that whispered of desire rather than duty. You have to understand the psychology of this world. Isolation doesn't just shape behavior, it distorts it. When every choice is confined to the same few people, the concept of normal begins to blur. A touch can feel like a spark. A glance can feel like a signal. And when generations grow accustomed to seeing family members as the only available companions, the boundaries between kinship and passion start to crumble. By the time the cousins we'll speak of were born, the pattern was already entrenched. They were the culmination of decades of choices, of marriages that never left the same circle, of whispered agreements that never made it to paper but ruled everything nonetheless. There was no scandal here, no gossip to spread beyond the wooded hills. The world outside would never know, because the world outside did not matter. What mattered was the way the cousins looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, the way their conversations lingered just a little too long, the way shared jokes carried the weight of a language spoken only within the family. And like all things that fester in secrecy, it became something inevitable, not a question of morality, not a question of choice. It was simply what happened when no one was ever meant to leave, and the same blood pulsed through the same veins, over and over, like a drumbeat no one could escape. By the time their story reaches us, the lines between love and compulsion, loyalty and obsession, have already blurred into something almost unrecognizable. And yet, it is precisely this blur, the humanity trapped inside the horror, that makes it so impossible to look away from. This is not a story of monsters. It is a story of humans, humans who carried the weight of inherited decisions, whose hearts and minds were shaped by centuries of isolation and secrecy. And in that shadow, two cousins, bound by blood, bound by desire, found themselves unable to exist apart from one another. They grew up in a world where every gaze, every word, every gesture was a reminder that the world outside the valley did not touch them. From the moment they could walk, they were aware of each other, in ways that went far beyond ordinary childhood closeness. Small hands brushing over the same chore, shared whispers in the fields, laughter that lingered longer than it should have. These were the first threads weaving a bond that would become both comforting and damning. By the time adolescence arrived, the boundaries that most families painstakingly enforce had already eroded. They were cousins, yes, but to them, the word carried little weight. It was a label, a formality, meaningless against the pulse of a connection that neither could name. The adults around them knew. In small towns, nothing is truly hidden, and yet knowledge here carried a different weight. Murmurs would float through the rooms like smoke, an acknowledgement of truths everyone recognized but no one dared confront. It was not outrage that governed their elders, but fear. Fear of the social consequences, fear of breaking the fragile balance that kept the family intact, fear of seeing something so intimate laid bare. And so, silence reigned, and the cousins were left to navigate the precarious territory of desire and kinship alone. The psychology of inherited isolation is cruel in ways subtle and unrelenting. In most families, distance is imposed. Cousins are separated by geography, by circumstance, by the invisible walls that separate bloodlines into discrete, manageable units. But here, distance did not exist. Every meal, every holiday, every casual Sunday brought them into proximity. Shared bedrooms in sprawling, overcrowded homes, shared chores, shared secrets, all compounded over time until the notion of separation became nearly impossible. Every attempt to flee or rebel only strengthened the tether, as if the land itself conspired to keep them bound. And yet, there was more than just circumstance at work. Genetics, social conditioning, and human desire collided in a way that created tension, both beautiful and grotesque. They were mirrors of one another, reflecting every imperfection and every yearning. The things that might have been innocent curiosity in another child were magnified by their isolation, turning playful touches into charged encounters, simple conversations into confessions. And while the world outside would see nothing wrong in their smiles and shared laughter, the truth simmering beneath was far more dangerous. An attachment that consumed, that demanded, that would not allow for separation. By late adolescence, what had begun as subtle fascination transformed into something undeniable. Their encounters, first tentative and hesitant, grew bolder, more urgent, as if driven by an invisible clock counting down the years they were allowed to be apart. In the shadows of their small, decaying homes, they discovered each other not just as cousins, but as co-conspirators in a taboo they had not yet fully understood. And in that forbidden space, they learned the intoxicating, destructive power of a love, or perhaps an obsession, that could not be named, that could not exist anywhere else, but within the confines of the family they could never leave. Even the surrounding community, tight, knit as it was, noticed subtle changes over time. Outsiders might have written them off as close or attached, failing to see the gravity behind their bond. But to those who paid attention, the tension was palpable, a quiet, persistent unease whenever they were in the same room, a glance held too long, a smile that spoke of secret knowledge. These were not simple acts of affection. They were the manifestations of a lineage reaching forward, carrying with it generations of twisted intimacy, of patterns repeated so often they had become invisible yet all-consuming. By the time they reached adulthood, the consequences of their choices, though unspoken, were already written into the very fabric of their lives. Every whispered secret, every forbidden touch, every shared moment of reckless closeness had left marks that could not be erased. Theirs was a love shaped by isolation, sharpened by secrecy, and reinforced by a history that insisted on repetition. Their families' patterns of inbreeding had long blurred the line between what was natural and what was taboo, and in this darkness they discovered a truth that few outside their world could understand. Their bond was not only inevitable, it was survival. The cousins began to move through their days with a strange combination of fear and certainty. Publicly, they assumed the roles expected of them. They smiled, worked, married other relatives when convenient, maintained appearances, all the while aware that the true center of their world existed only when they were together. This duality, the private and the public, created a tension that was both haunting and magnetic. Those who glimpsed the depth of it could not look away, though most would never dare to speak of it. They had become both prisoners and rulers of their own isolated kingdom, a world where desire, necessity, and lineage collided in ways too dangerous for outsiders to comprehend. Their physical resemblance, sharpened by generations of close kinship, made their connection even more compelling and more disturbing. Eyes, hair, mannerisms, even the subtle inflections of their speech mirrored one another so closely that the world seemed to fold around them. In each other they saw themselves, but also a reflection of a family history they could never escape. Every moment apart was filled with longing. Every glance together was fraught with unspoken understanding. They were bound by blood, bound by geography, and bound by something darker, the knowledge that their attachment defied convention, reason, and law, and the consequences were not only emotional, they were genetic. The family's insistence on keeping bloodlines close had already produced children with rare illnesses, deformities, and conditions that marked the next generation. The cousins, fully aware of these risks, pressed forward regardless. There was a compulsion here that logic could not contain, a psychological need to preserve the lineage in its purest, most insular form, even at the cost of life itself. In a way, the horrors that emerged were almost predictable, yet they did nothing to slow the cycle. Every generation seemed destined to repeat the same story, as if trapped in an endless loop of intimacy and destruction. In the hidden corners of their homes, in the quiet rooms no outsider could see, they created a private world governed by its own rules. Words of affection, gestures of desire, and moments of profound intimacy existed in spaces untouched by judgment. Here, morality was irrelevant, law was irrelevant, and shame was a concept borrowed from the outside. They were free, but in their freedom lay the shadow of inevitability. Theirs was a story written in the bloodlines of ancestors, a tale of repetition and obsession, of desire entwined with destiny. And yet, there was something undeniably tragic in their journey. It was not the mere act of forbidden closeness that horrified, but the fact that this intimacy, this obsessive attachment, was never chosen. It was inherited. Theirs was not a tale of rebellion, but of surrender. Surrender to the weight of isolation, to the pull of genetics, to the invisible chains of a family history too powerful to resist. And in surrendering, they had become the living proof of a truth that is difficult to accept, that sometimes the most terrifying legacies are the ones we inherit, not the ones we choose. It's easy to look at this story and see only horror, but there is something far more unsettling beneath the surface, the way ordinary humans can become complicit in their own undoing. The cousins did not awaken one day with a plan to break moral codes. They were products of a history that had shaped them, molded them, and whispered its expectations into every fiber of their being. Each generation preceding them had made choices that seemed small at the time, marrying within the family, keeping land consolidated, protecting reputation. But these small acts compounded over decades until the outcome became something that could no longer be escaped. What outsiders would call depravity, insiders would call inevitability. Their bond became an obsession that was at once tender and grotesque. They were both caretaker and captive to one another. Every conversation carried undertones that outsiders would not recognize. Every gesture of comfort contained a charge impossible to articulate, and while it is tempting to judge from afar, it is more instructive and far more haunting to understand how isolation warps human instinct. Love, in this context, was not purely emotional. It was survival, legacy, and compulsion intertwined. The line between nurture and need, affection and addiction, blurred until the two were indistinguishable. Community boundaries, thin as they were, began to fray around them. Relatives, neighbors, and even the local clergy seemed aware of something unspoken, yet none dared confront it openly. Silence became the only method of self-preservation. And so the cousins existed in a strange liminal space, part of the community, yet untouchable by its laws, observed, yet invisible, normal, yet grotesque. Their lives were a study in contradictions, a live experiment in how secrecy and proximity can amplify desire to a near, unstoppable force. Children were born into this world, innocence yet tainted by the legacy of repeated bloodlines. Some bore physical marks, rare genetic disorders that spoke of generations of close kinship. Others were spared the visible consequences, yet the psychological patterns persisted. The family had unwittingly created a cycle that could not be broken without catastrophic rupture. And the cousins, fully aware of these risks, continued regardless, bound by affection, by lust, by inevitability, and by the invisible pull of generations of isolation. And here is the cruelest aspect: no external force could intervene effectively. The cousins' story was so tightly enmeshed with family, land, and local custom that even well-meaning outsiders could not disrupt the cycle. Authorities were distant, neighbors were cautious, and the terrain itself, both social and physical, ensured that escape was nearly impossible. Every attempt to impose distance only intensified the bond. The very geography of their world had conspired to create a private theater of obsession, a place where nothing outside could intrude, and everything within was magnified. It is at this point in the story that we begin to see the true human cost. The cousins were not villains. They were the product of a system that prioritized continuity over sanity, blood over freedom. Their emotional lives were a tangle of longing and guilt, desire and inevitability. Every decision carried echoes of past generations. Every gesture was weighted with ancestral memory. And perhaps most haunting of all, in each other they found something they could not find anywhere else. A reflection, a validation, a connection so profound it outweighed fear, morality, and even self-preservation. By now, their story has reached a point that is almost unbearable to observe, and yet it is here, in the quiet accumulation of years, that the most haunting truths emerge. Their lives were not defined by a single scandal, a single act, or a single moment of passion. They were defined by repetition. Patterns repeated themselves silently across generations. Every glance, every touch, every whispered promise carried the weight of ancestors who had walked the same paths, who had succumbed to the same compulsions, who had lived and died under the same oppressive rhythm of blood and desire. It was not just their story, it was the story of the family itself, a lineage both fragile and unyielding, trapped in cycles that could not be broken. It is tempting to imagine that love, even when entwined with taboo, might offer something redeeming. But in this case, the lines between affection and possession had long since dissolved. Their intimacy was both refuge and prison, a private world built on longing yet shadowed by the inevitability of consequence. Outside their circle, a different reality persisted. Neighbors married, children went to school, time moved forward. But within the family, time seemed suspended, looping endlessly back on itself. Every reunion, every gathering, every simple conversation was a reinforcement of the bond that could never be released. Genetics, isolation, and secrecy converged to create outcomes that were impossible to untangle. Children born into the family carried the literal and figurative weight of this history. Some suffered physical deformities, rare disorders that marked them as products of repeated bloodlines. Others appeared outwardly healthy, yet the psychological imprint remained. An attachment to family that bordered on obsession, a tendency to replicate behaviors inherited rather than chosen. In this hidden archive of American life, the cousins were both the inheritors and perpetuators of a cycle that was quietly catastrophic. And yet, despite the horror, there was something magnetic about their story. Perhaps it is the way humans are drawn to secrets, to darkness, to the edges of morality, that makes us unable to look away. Here were two individuals who embodied the collision of desire and inheritance, of instinct and taboo, of intimacy and destruction. Watching their lives unfold feels like peering into a mirror no one wants to hold, seeing not monsters but humans, and realizing that under certain conditions, any of us could be shaped by forces larger than our comprehension. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have fought the pull, or would you have succumbed, knowing there was no escape from the weight of history? These are the questions their lives leave behind, lingering like shadows long after the story has been told. The cousins themselves lived in a fog of inevitability, unable to separate love from inheritance, intimacy from compulsion, desire from destiny. As the years stretched on, the outside world faded further, leaving only the echo of family, the pulse of repeated bloodlines, the whisper of secrets that no one could share. Their story is one of inevitability, a testament to the ways human beings can be shaped, and sometimes trapped, by forces older than themselves. And in the end, it is not simply the actions that haunt, but the patterns, the repetition, the understanding that in some families, history is a prison as much as it is a legacy. By now, the cousins' lives had become inseparable from the legacy of their family. Each decision, each interaction, was informed by the invisible chains of ancestry. They moved through the world with a dual consciousness, one for the eyes of neighbors, the other for the eyes of each other. To anyone looking in, they were merely close relatives, perhaps unusually devoted, but in truth, every moment was a negotiation with the gravity of desire and blood. It was a life lived in quiet tension, a world where ordinary emotions were magnified and ordinary choices became impossible. The psychological weight they carried was immense. Love here was inseparable from guilt, intimacy inseparable from secrecy. The cousins knew that their bond would shock outsiders, that the genetic consequences could be devastating, yet none of this lessened the compulsion. Their world had been so carefully insulated, their environment so meticulously controlled, that the notion of separating, even for a short time, was unimaginable. It was as if the family itself, over generations, had built an invisible lattice to ensure they would remain bound, each new generation adding threads that were both protective and imprisoning. Over time, the family began to fracture under the weight of this unspoken truth. Some relatives sought to leave, marry outsiders, escape the repeating pattern. Others attempted to intervene, hoping to prevent the continuation of genetic complications or social stigma, but each effort only reinforced the bond of the cousins. Attempts at distance created longing. Attempts at separation intensified attachment. The pull between them was no longer simply desire. It had become a gravitational force, invisible yet irresistible. The family could not intervene without collapsing the fragile social ecosystem it had built, and so silence persisted, a tacit acknowledgement that this cycle, no matter how destructive, would continue. Children born into this environment inherited more than genes. They inherited patterns of attachment, behaviors, and the heavy imprint of secrecy. Some bore visible consequences, congenital disorders, unusual physical traits, or chronic illnesses that marked them as products of repeated bloodlines. Others carried the subtler burdens, intense emotional dependency, compulsive behavior, or the unshakable sense that family loyalty was an absolute law. These children were both innocent and complicit, living proof that the past never truly dies. It lingers, embedded in flesh, mind, and behavior. And in this cycle, the cousins themselves were at once victims and perpetuators. They were trapped by their inheritance, yet they willingly engaged in it, drawn to each other by instincts older than conscience. Every touch, every whisper, every fleeting moment of connection was a reenactment of history. Each generation added weight to the invisible ledger of human desire, making the story more inevitable, more tragic, and more impossible to escape. What makes their story profoundly haunting is that it is not abstract. It is real, it is human, and it is ongoing. It is not merely the taboo that shocks, but the way ordinary life, work, family, love can be distorted by isolation, secrecy, and inheritance. The cousins' lives were ordinary in many ways, yet in other ways, they were a testament to the ways human instincts can be warped when generations of patterns go unchallenged. In their story, horror is quiet, psychological, and persistent, a shadow that lingers long after the facts have been recounted. As the years stretched into decades, the full weight of their choices and the legacy of their family became impossible to ignore. The cousins aged together, their lives entwined in ways that neither the outside world nor even time itself could untangle. The outside world continued its march, indifferent to the insular drama playing out in the hidden valleys of Appalachia, but within that world, every day reinforced the bonds that had begun in childhood. Their love, or obsession, depending on how you interpret it, was now tempered by experience, by the knowledge of risk, and by the haunting recognition that separation was no longer an option. The genetic consequences, once theoretical, became tangible. Some children exhibited profound physical or cognitive challenges, stark reminders of the dangers inherent in repeated bloodlines. Others carried subtler scars, temperaments marked by anxiety, hyper-attachment, or an unexplainable sense of inevitability. The cousins, witnessing these outcomes, were forced to confront the duality of their legacy. They had inherited a pattern, perpetuated it, and now faced the moral and emotional consequences. And yet their attachment to each other, to the family, to the invisible chains of inheritance, remained unbroken. It is here that the story becomes truly harrowing. The cousins were trapped in a cycle with no clear exit. Distance intensified longing, proximity intensified obsession, and every generation amplified the previous one's mistakes. Attempts to intervene, to alter the course, only proved the futility of resistance. Their story was no longer merely about love or desire. It had become a testament to the inescapability of lineage, to the way history and biology can bind people more tightly than any law or moral code. Every choice they made was a thread woven into a fabric that stretched back generations and forward into a future they could not control. In the quiet moments, the late nights when the rest of the household slept, or the brief pauses between meals and chores, the cousins confronted the reality of their lives. They were bound not only to each other, but to a lineage that demanded repetition. There was no clear villain here, no singular moment of cruelty, only the slow, inexorable pull of inheritance. They were both caretakers and captives of their own history, aware of the consequences but powerless to resist the forces that shaped them. And yet, there was a strange, undeniable humanity in this. It is easy to sensationalize the taboo, to reduce the story to horror alone. But beneath the grotesque and unsettling lies a psychological truth. Humans are profoundly shaped by the environments they inherit, by the patterns of behavior passed passed down through generations, and by the isolation or pressures imposed by circumstance. The cousin's story is not simply a cautionary tale. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility and resilience of the human psyche, the ways we are both shaped by and complicit in the forces of our own making. In the end, the cousins' lives became an archive of repetition and desire, a living testament to the weight of history. They were not monsters, nor were they merely victims. They were humans caught in a cycle older than themselves, forced to navigate the interplay of inheritance, obsession, and love. And in that navigation, in that quiet, persistent tension, lies the haunting truth. Some legacies are so deeply rooted that they cannot be escaped, only endured, observed, and remembered. By the time their story reaches the present, the cousins' world has become a study in inevitability. Generations have come and gone, yet the patterns endure, echoing like a distant, inescapable drumbeat. Their lives are not defined by single shocking acts, but by the accumulation of small, intimate decisions repeated over decades. Every smile shared, every touch prolonged, every moment of closeness contributes to a history that cannot be rewritten, and in this repetition lies the true horror, not the act itself, but the way it quietly dictates everything that follows. The isolation that once seemed benign now feels almost predatory. It shaped their instincts, sharpened their desires, and made the ordinary extraordinary in ways outsiders could never comprehend. They existed in a world apart, where the normal rules of family, morality, and consequence were rewritten in the language of blood and familiarity. Each choice they made was informed not by ethics alone, but by the invisible gravity of generations, a force that made separation impossible and attachment inevitable. Children, born into this cycle, inherit more than genes. They inherit history, expectation, and a pattern of emotional entanglement that is impossible to ignore. Some bear physical consequences, others psychological, yet all are touched by the legacy of repeated bloodlines. In witnessing this, the cousins confront both their power and their helplessness. They can perpetuate the cycle, attempt to mitigate its outcomes, but never fully escape its influence. Theirs is a family where every decision resonates for decades, where private intimacy collides with generational consequence, and where love and obsession are indistinguishable. And yet, the story retains an almost hypnotic human quality. In the quiet of their lives, behind closed doors, the cousins demonstrate the complexity of human attachment. Desire, duty, and instinct intermingle until they are impossible to separate. To outsiders, it may appear grotesque. To psychologists, it may read as compulsion and learned behavior. But to the cousins themselves, it is life, messy, complicated, inevitable. They navigate a world defined by history and biology, yet infused with moments of tenderness, of vulnerability, of shared understanding that exists nowhere else. This is the uncomfortable truth that lingers long after the tale is told. Horror is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it is quiet, embedded in repetition, intimacy, and inheritance. Sometimes it is the reflection of ourselves, amplified through isolation, environment, and compulsion. The cousin's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable question of how much of our behavior is chosen and how much is inherited, how patterns can dictate lives in ways that morality, law, or reason cannot override. And so, the cousins remain a haunting echo of human psychology and family legacy. They are a reminder that history is alive, that inheritance is not just genetic, but emotional, and that in certain corners of the world, the past does not stay buried. Their lives are a testament to cycles that are impossible to fully escape, a shadowed archive of desire, compulsion, and inevitability. And as you consider their story, as you feel its weight settle into your mind, remember this: some secrets are meant to remain hidden, yet some truths, no matter how dark, demand to be remembered. Finally, we arrive at the end of their story, the chapter that is both inevitable and unbearable. The cousins, now adults shaped by decades of entwined lives, exist in a world where the past and present are indistinguishable. Every action, every choice, every fleeting moment of intimacy is a continuation of a legacy that began long before they were born. There is no simple resolution here, no redemption, no escape, only the weight of inheritance pressing down like a silent, unyielding hand. Their lives are a testament to the consequences of repetition, to the way isolation and blood can intertwine to produce patterns that defy morality and logic alike. As we trace the arc of their existence, it becomes clear that this is not merely a story of forbidden closeness or taboo. It is a story of inevitability, of how human beings can be shaped by forces both internal and external, by the inheritance of generations and the environment that fosters obsession. The cousins' lives, marked by desire, guilt, and compulsion, are the culmination of centuries of choices, some deliberate, some accidental, that created a world where separation was impossible and attachment unavoidable. It is here that the tragedy of their story becomes most palpable. They are not evil, nor are they innocent. They are human, painfully, tragically human, caught in a cycle that they could neither fully understand nor escape. The children born into this lineage carry with them the indelible marks of the past, both visible and invisible. Some suffer from physical or cognitive challenges, while others bear psychological imprints: intense attachment, compulsive behavior, or a preternatural understanding of family history that they cannot articulate. Each generation becomes both victim and participant, a living record of the forces that shaped the cousins' lives. And yet, despite the evident suffering, the cycle persists, illustrating the quiet but relentless power of inheritance over choice. And perhaps the most haunting aspect of all is the normalcy with which life continues. Outside the confines of their isolated world, time moves forward, the seasons change, communities evolve. Yet within the family, the rhythm of repetition persists, like a metronome marking the passage of inevitable desire. Every reunion, every shared moment, every glance is a reinforcement of patterns older than memory, older than morality, older than the laws that govern the outside world. The cousins and their descendants are caught in this rhythm, participants in a cycle that is as much a psychological phenomenon as it is a familial one. In the end, their story leaves us with a lingering unease, a reminder of the fragile line between love and compulsion, desire and inheritance, humanity and horror. It is not the acts themselves that shock us most, but the context, the inevitability, and the intimate human truths that underpin them. These cousins, unable to separate themselves from one another, are both a cautionary tale and a window into the quiet horrors that can emerge in isolation, secrecy, and repetition. Their lives are now an archive of memory, a shadowed testament to the weight of history. And as we close this chapter, we are left with a final, unsettling thought. Some legacies cannot be escaped. They linger in blood, in behavior, in the quiet repetition of generations, waiting silently for those who follow to inherit and perhaps repeat the story that was never meant to be told.